With us now is our first guest in our new studio space. Matt Kennard is a journalist and author, founder of Declassified UK, and we now know subject of GCHQ investigations because of the amount of clarity and truth. Matt, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your book, How Corporations Overthrew Democracy, is coming out next year. And I suppose the title suggests, mate, that you're talking about how the influence of corporations through lobbying and the funding of the political process has reached sort of saturation point. Am I right? Can you give us some good examples about the worst examples?
It's a bigger kind of time period that I look at. We basically go back to the 1950s when decolonization was happening and empires were losing their formal control of poor countries. And corporations and private capital were very concerned about this. How do we maintain control when we haven't got formal garrisons of troops to kind of, take out a leader that nationalizes something? And they erected all sorts of systems whereby they could make sure that their power and their interests were protected. One of them that we started, the book starts with is this shadow legal system. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, called Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS.
And
they make it sound boring so people don't want to.
Who cares about something that's in the shadows and has got a long name like that?
Exactly, but actually it's majorly important, and it's a system that allows corporations to sue states all over the world who enact policies that they don't like. So for example, this is a real case. Egypt raises the minimum wage. A French water company doesn't like that. Says,
I don't like it.
Exactly, I don't like it. You can't do that.
It's pricey. We've got to pay them that now.
Exactly.
It's the minimum.
So they take them to these courts and say, you're impacting our profits. You can't do that. And
so there's a judicial system already in place that's transcendent of national sovereignty.
By design. They wanted to have a new system in place when decolonization happened, whereby they could bypass local resistance, bypass local revolutionary movements, whatever it was. There was a lot of tumult in that period. This is one of them. There's others, but
I like that example. I was just thinking, mate, that prior to the colonisation model, or at the advent of certain aspects of British colonialism, there was already corporatism sort of baked in, when it made through like the East India Tea Company, the army went in to support their interests. So in a sense, we're seeing a return to a model that preceded national colonisation? Was corporatism, in a sense, the foundation of colonisation?
It was, but it was much easier to enforce when you had a formal empire, because, as I said, you could just take out leaders you didn't like.
Shoot them.
Exactly. Well, literally. Or remove. Like in Egypt, the president nationalised the Suez Canal in 1956, and Britain, France and Israel invaded. You said you can't do that. In 1953, the democratic president, Iran was a democracy at this point, the democratic president of Iran, Mossadegh, nationalized the oil company, the Anglo-Persian oil company. MI6 CIA took him out. Iran's never been a democracy again. So that's the other element of this, is that states are acting for corporate interests and always have. When you look at declassified documents and stuff, all the stuff you hear on the TV about, the government is there to protect national security and we're protecting you. In fact, what they're talking about on the inside is how do we project corporate power and how do we protect big business interests globally. And in the UK, we have BAE Systems and BP, two examples. Large parts of the British state are set up to export their interests and to maintain their interests. Tax, for example, BAE Systems is an interesting one. There's a whole department.
Like, so what? It was meant to be British Airways, right?
No, BAE Systems is the arms company.
Oh, BAE, yeah.
Yeah, it was privatised by Thatcher, but it sells billions of pounds of weaponry around the world.
Is it our biggest and best
It's our biggest.
weapons?
It's completely dominated by BAE Systems, the UK weapons industry. And a lot of it goes to the Saudis. And they've sold 17.6 billion at least since the war in Yemen. But anyway, I'll just finish. There's a large part of the Department for International Trade which is set up, taxpayers' department, it's funded by the taxpayer, which is set up to promote BAE Systems' interests. So there's no differentiation between the state and the corporation on many of these issues.
It's extraordinary to discover that in various ways we think that there is a kind of secularism, that there is a separation between these interests, but we've discovered now from the degree of infiltration in like social media companies that CIA and FBI agenda can be met within apparently neutral or at least private social media sites. And you're saying that corporatism has had tendrils and tentacles into all manner of governmental agencies. In fact, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's part of the way the system is established.
Yeah, it's like a Frankenstein effect, because governments initially created corporations, chartered corporations. That's what they started as in like the 17th century in England, where the government would need to build a bridge, for example. So they create a chartered company, which would be dissolved at the end of building that bridge. But gradually they became more exotic, the structure, joint stockholder companies, so you could invest in companies, and they would last longer than the project. And then over the thesis in the book is that since the Second World War, the corporation has completely eaten the state that created it. And in fact, it's wrong to think of the state acting in our interests. We don't live in a democracy because, I mean, you see a lot of conspiracy theories these days. And I think a large part of the reason is people look at the politicians on TV and say, these aren't the people making the decisions. There's something happening off screen. So without a kind of analysis which is based in the real world, you can easily say it's this person or it's some conspiracy theory. But in fact, what it is corporate power. Politicians are working for corporations. And you see that even in countries which have elected liberation leaders. For example, for the book, we went to El Salvador, which was the victim of a case from a mining company, a legal case, because it didn't give an environmental permit to a Canadian mining company. They said, well, you can't do that. We're going to sue you for $300 million. So we went to El Salvador to look at this case. And we were talking to ministers who were part of the FMLN government, which is a sort of came out of the Marxist guerrillas in the 80s. They're not part of the system in that way. But we said to him, why are you doing so little to change things in El Salvador? And they said, we can't move. When we lost the civil war in El Salvador and Capital won, the US Empire won, we were integrated into the system. We signed bilateral investment treaties, we signed aid pacts, we signed all these different things, which mean 20 years later, we still can't move. So we want to nationalize the water company. Oh no, you can't do that.
Then were the glory days of utility, when a corporation would just build a bridge and then disband after the bridge has been built. That must have been sort of such a lovely, simple time to have lived in. We need a bridge, we've built a bridge. We shall now disband, gentlemen. But ultimately, this thing has mutated into some nefarious and untenable monster. If in a country like El Salvador, in that region, with its strong ties to socialism and revolutionary politics and radicalism and its deeply entrenched opposition to Northern American style corporatism, you can track examples like that. God alone knows what it must be like in companies where there are deep roots of corporatism. Mate, what kind of power are organizations like Amazon able to exert over American politics? And where do you see this dynamic playing out in big tech in countries like the United States and ours? I was thinking for a minute, like say that you did have a Bernie Sanders style Democrat Party or a Jeremy Corbyn style Labour Party, and you would have got nationalisation of utilities and railways and water and all that. They'd have shut that shit down double fast, wouldn't they? Like, you don't really get those kind of options explored. So in countries where it's all stitched up and sewn up, like ours in the United States of America, where many of our adored viewers will be right now, what level of power have Amazon got, and how do they assert it? And do they need to resort to sort of like skullduggery and trickery, or is it legalised and systemised to such a degree that they can just do it, legit?
Yeah, it's systemized and it's very conscious. They set this up in the 1950s globally, but in the US particularly in the 60s, they were freaking out because of the tumult that was happening in terms of the left worker movements, union movements, social movements, civil rights, feminism, all these different things. That there was actual real panic in Washington. There was a thing called the Powell Memorandum, which was written by Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court judge, where he's basically just like, look, we're losing. Corporations are really losing now. There's we've lost the narrative. We need to fight back. And they did fight back, and they won. So from the 60s onwards, they pumped huge amounts of money into think tanks like Heritage, Cato, Chamber of Commerce. There was a real conscious effort to wrest back control of the narrative, to wrest back control of society, and they won. And there's that phrase that, like, the left won the cultural war of the 60s, but lost the right one, the economic war. And I think there's some truth to that, because they put tons of resources. That's domestically. In terms of these companies, social media companies are interesting ones, because you mentioned Sanders and Corbyn. I don't think we could have had them in the way we did without Twitter and Facebook, because they have democratized the media. They've taken power out hands of legacy media. You know, like before that, it was the businessmen who controlled who controlled the printing presses and the newspapers. They had a complete hold on the mind of the population. Then you had social media allowed us to circumvent that and to get our stuff out without needing to be part of that.
Yeah.
And that's why you see Corbyn and Sanders. Of course, the difficulty is then we rely on them so much and they're owned by these oligarchs who can just pull the plug whenever they want.
Plus, they found ways of infiltrating it, and ultimately their interests will align because they ultimately will be beholden to the same groups of shareholders and submerged interest, bloody Vanguard and BlackRock and all that gear. That will start cropping up sooner or later, won't it, if you investigate long enough? And evidently you have done investigations. Watch entire episodes on demand for free at rumble.com/Russell Brand.